Hey there, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. You know we love to get our hands dirty in a good read.
Yeah.
And today we're wading
I
through
like that visual.
some excerpts you shared from the Narrowcorridor. States, Societies, and the Fate of Liberty.
Right.
A book that dives into the power struggle between governments and the people they govern.
A fascinating dynamic, to be sure. It's a bit like a dance, wouldn't you say? A delicate balance between the need for order and the desire for freedom.
Totally. And that's what's got you hooked, right?
Yeah.
You're fascinated by this idea of the narrow corridor,
Right.
where a strong state and individual liberty somehow coexist.
Mm-hmm.
Not an easy feat, that's for sure.
Not at all. The book sets the stage by contrasting two starkly different visions of the future.
Okay.
One is Robert Kaplan's coming anarchy, where states crumble, leading to anarchy.
Right.
The other is Francis Fukuyama's End of History, suggesting we're all headed towards a U.S.-style democracy.
Wow. Talk about extremes. But that really frames the core question, doesn't it?
It does.
Is there a middle ground?
Yeah.
A way to have both order and freedom?
Precisely. And that's where this idea of the Leviathan comes in.
Yeah.
The book uses it as a metaphor for a strong centralized government.
Okay.
Not necessarily a bad thing in itself, as it's meant to keep chaos, what they call the war at bay.
Right.
It's like that old Thomas Hobbes quote, right? Without a Leviathan, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Okay, so a strong government is necessary, but how do we keep it from becoming tyrannical? I'm sensing a but coming.
Here's the catch. Not all Leviathans are created equal.
Oh boy.
The book distinguishes between two main types.
Okay.
The despotic Leviathan, think of it like a puppet master,
Mm-hmm.
exerts immense control, often suppressing individual freedoms. China's current government often gets labeled this way.
Okay, so that's the one we want to avoid.
Right.
What's the alternative, though?
The ideal scenario, according to the book, is a shackled Leviathan.
Okay.
In this scenario, society is holding the reins.
Okay.
Think of it like a system of checks and balances, with regulations, citizen participation, that sort of thing.
Right.
The book dives into historical examples comparing places like Switzerland, a shackled Leviathan, with Prussia, which leaned more towards the despotic side, to understand what factors nudge societies in one direction or the other.
And I bet those historical comparisons are full of surprises, right? You were telling me about ancient Athens the other day, and I was blown away.
Athens is a fascinating case.
Yeah.
They had this system called ostracism, where citizens could literally vote to exile someone for 10 years by writing their name on a piece of pottery, an ostracon.
What?
Talk about direct democracy in action. Then you have medieval Italy, with city-states like Siena flourishing with intricate systems of governance that kept any one person or group from grabbing too much power.
It's like these societies intuitively understood the importance of balancing power. But the book argues that a strong society isn't just about restraining the state right.
Right.
It needs a life of its own.
Absolutely. They call this the Red Queen effect. This constant need for both the state and society to keep evolving and adapting just to maintain the balance of power.
Wow.
Think of it like an arms race, but instead of weapons, they're vying for liberty.
Okay, I love that analogy.
Yeah.
So it's not enough to just have a constitution or a set of laws.
Right.
You need a society that's actively engaged, pushing back, holding the state accountable.
Precisely. And the book illustrates this with some compelling examples.
Okay.
Take 19th century England during the Industrial Revolution.
Right.
You had new social movements, emerging trade unions gaining power, and eventually expansions of voting rights.
Right.
It was like the state was forced to adapt to society's demands for greater freedom and rights.
It's a fascinating example of how societal shifts can force governments to evolve, almost like they had to keep pace or risk being overthrown.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we see a similar pattern in the U.S. during the Civil Rights Movement, a powerful social movement that pushed the state to change to become more inclusive. These weren't just protests. These were movements that fundamentally shifted the power balance.
So this narrow corridor isn't some static endpoint.
Right.
It's a constant dance between state and society. It sounds exhausting, frankly.
It can be.
Yeah.
And tragically, societies can easily lose their footing, slipping either toward despotism or chaos.
And I'm guessing the book is full of cautionary tales about societies that lost their balance. We don't need to get into those right now.
Or let's save the gory details.
Yeah.
The point is, even seemingly stable societies can unravel surprisingly quickly.
Right.
And that brings us to today, to the challenges we face in our own time.
Okay, so we've seen how societies throughout history have grappled with this balance between state and society. But let's bring it closer to home.
Right.
How does this whole narrow corridor idea play out in our own lives?
That's the beauty of this framework. It's not just about ancient history or far-off countries. It's about the choices we make every day, the institutions we support, even the way we interact with each other.
So it's like this narrow corridor isn't something out there.
No.
It's something we're all navigating constantly, whether we realize it or not.
Precisely. Think about it. How much do we rely on the government in our daily lives? For security, for justice, for education, for healthcare.
Right.
We need a strong state to provide these things, but we also need to ensure it doesn't become overbearing, that it doesn't infringe on our individual rights.
That's like walking a tightrope, right?
Yeah.
You need that tension on both sides to stay balanced. Too much power on either side and the whole thing collapses.
Exactly. And the book emphasizes that this balance is dynamic, constantly in flux. It's not something we figure out once and for all.
Right.
It's an ongoing process, a constant negotiation between state and society.
Okay, so how do we make sure we're staying on that tightrope, so to speak? What can we actually do to strengthen this narrow corridor in our own societies?
The book highlights the crucial role of a vibrant civil society.
Right.
It's about citizens getting involved in their communities, holding their leaders accountable, and making it clear that the government works for the people, not the other way around.
And they're not just talking about voting once every few years. Right?
Yeah, no.
It's about being engaged on a deeper level.
Absolutely. They talk about the power of social movements to drive change, like the civil rights movement here in the U.S. or the women's suffrage movement in England.
Right.
These were movements that fundamentally reshaped the relationship between state and society. A free press is vital, as are independent courts, a robust system of checks and balances. These are all essential components of a healthy, narrow corridor.
So it's about using the tools of democracy, engaging in the marketplace of ideas, making our voices heard.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the book argues that this engagement can't be a one-time thing.
Right.
It's an ongoing responsibility, a constant push and pull to ensure our liberties are safeguarded.
It sounds almost like an ecosystem, this narrow corridor. You can't just focus on one part.
Right.
It's about maintaining the health of the entire system.
Exactly. And a healthy society isn't just about holding the state accountable.
All right.
It's about cultivating strong communities with their own norms and institutions that uphold individual freedom. The book uses this fascinating example of the Tiv people,
Okay.
where their traditional reliance on witchcraft accusations, while intended to limit individual power, ultimately backfired.
Hold on, witchcraft accusations.
Yeah.
How does that fit in?
It's a fascinating example of how even well-intentioned social norms can have unintended consequences. In the Tiv society, accusing someone of witchcraft was a way of keeping powerful individuals in check.
Okay.
But it also created a system where anyone could be accused based on rumor or personal vendettas. When modern weapons became available, this system, designed for a different time, actually made them more vulnerable to powerful warlords.
Wow, that's a cautionary tale if I've ever heard one. It's not enough to have good intentions.
Right.
You have to have a system that actually works, that can adapt to new challenges.
Precisely. The book argues that we need a culture that values individual freedom intrinsically,
Right.
that encourages critical thinking, and that empowers people to challenge abuses of power no matter where they come from.
So it's about building a society with a strong moral compass,
Yeah.
one where individual rights are respected, not just because the government says so, but because it's woven into the fabric of who we are.
Exactly. And that kind of cultural shift starts at the grassroots level in our homes, schools, and communities. It's about fostering a sense of shared responsibility for safeguarding our freedoms.
Okay, so we've talked about civil society, social norms. This all sounds very idealistic.
Yeah.
But the book acknowledges that the narrow corridor isn't always straightforward.
Right. They make a really interesting point about the shape of the narrow corridor. It's not this straight, predictable path. It can widen and narrow, even have dead ends or forks in the road. Navigating it requires constant vigilance and careful consideration.
So it's not just about finding the path, it's about knowing which way to turn when you reach a fork, making the right choices along the way.
Precisely. And to illustrate this point, they use the example of Chile in the 1970s. You had a democratically elected socialist government full of good intentions attempting these radical reforms.
And it ended in a military coup,
Yeah.
right? Backed by the U.S., no less.
Yes, a dark chapter for sure. But the book argues that Chile's tragedy wasn't just about a few bad actors.
Right.
It was about the specific constraints of the narrow corridor in Chile at that time.
Yeah.
The balance of power, the existing institutions, even cultural factors. They all played a role in making it incredibly difficult to sustain such radical change.
So even with the best of intentions, even with popular support, sometimes the context, the shape of the corridor, just isn't conducive to certain paths.
Exactly. They compare this to Sweden, where a social democratic government managed to build a robust welfare state without triggering a backlash or undermining individual freedoms.
Okay, so what was different about Sweden? Why were they able to walk that tightrope when Chile couldn't?
The book argues that Sweden's success stemmed from a unique blend of factors: a strong tradition of social solidarity, a highly organized labor movement, and perhaps most importantly, a business community that was willing to work with the government, not against it.
So it sounds like finding the balance within the narrow corridor often requires compromise,
Yeah.
a willingness to find common ground even between groups with different interests.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that we're all in this together and that finding solutions that work for everyone, not just for a select few, is the best way to ensure lasting stability and progress.
Okay, so we've talked about civil society social norms navigating the twists and turns of the narrow corridor. It's clear that institutions play a huge role,
Yes.
but the book seems to argue that they're especially crucial in this whole equation.
Yes, they refer to institutions as the very bones of the narrow corridor. Think of them as the scaffolding that provides structure and support, preventing the whole thing from collapsing.
So it's not enough to just have a well-written constitution or a set of laws on paper.
Right.
You need the right institutions in place to ensure those laws are actually upheld and individual rights are protected. It's about putting those ideals into practice.
Exactly. And they argue that these institutions must be both independent and accountable.
Right.
Independent from the state, so they can't be easily manipulated by those in power,
Right.
but also accountable to the public, so they don't become too powerful themselves. It's a delicate balance,
Right.
but essential for a thriving narrow corridor.
Right. It's that classic tension again,
Yeah.
that need for balance. But when we talk about institutions, we're not just talking about government agencies or courts.
Very true. You're right. The book emphasizes the interplay between formal institutions, like the ones we just mentioned, and informal institutions.
Okay.
The unwritten rules, the social norms, the cultural values that shape how a society functions. They argue that you can't have one without the other.
So it's like you can have the best designed legal system in the world,
Right.
but if people don't respect the rule of law, if corruption is rampant, if there's no trust in the system,
Right.
well, it's all for nothing.
Exactly. They give the example of the United States where alongside formal institutions, you have this rich tapestry of informal institutions.
Yeah.
Churches, voluntary associations, even things like bowling leagues.
Right.
They all contribute to a sense of social trust and shared responsibility.
It's about those everyday interactions, those networks of trust and reciprocity that underpin a healthy society.
Yes.
And I imagine the book contrasts this with countries where those informal institutions might be, well, less conducive to a shackled leviathan.
Absolutely. They talk about how in many developing countries, informal institutions of patronage, corruption, or tribalism can make it incredibly difficult to establish effective formal institutions. It creates a vicious cycle where people are more likely to rely on personal connections or bribes than on the rule of law.
So it's not enough to just reform the government or implement new policies. You have to address those deeply ingrained cultural norms and behaviors that undermine the very foundations of a just and equitable society. It's a tall order, to say the least.
It is indeed a monumental challenge, but the book argues that it's not insurmountable. Societies can evolve and change their informal institutions just as they can change their formal ones. It requires a long-term perspective, a willingness to challenge those deeply held beliefs and behaviors, and a commitment to building a better future for all.
So we've talked about the dangers of a state that becomes too dominant, too controlling, but the book also highlights the flip side, right?
Yes.
The dangers of having a state that's too weak, too ineffective.
Absolutely. The narrow corridor, as the name suggests, is a delicate balancing act.
Yeah.
Too much state power leads to tyranny, as we've discussed, but too little state power can be just as dangerous, leading to chaos and anarchy.
And I'm guessing they have some pretty compelling examples of this as well.
They do. They point to the tragic case of Somalia, where the collapse of the central government in the early 1990s led to a horrific civil war and the rise of powerful warlords. Afghanistan provides another stark illustration where the lack of a strong, capable state has created a breeding ground for extremism and instability.
So it's not just about limiting the state's power. It's about ensuring the state has enough power to fulfill its basic functions, to provide security, to enforce the law, to protect its citizens from harm, both internal and external.
Exactly. And finding that sweet spot, that Goldilocks zone, where the state is strong enough to be effective, but not so strong that it becomes oppressive, That's the essence of the challenge.
So how do we find that balance?
Yeah.
How do we ensure the state has enough power to do its job without tipping over into authoritarianism?
This is where that idea of the Red Queen effect comes into play again. A strong, engaged citizenry is the best defense against a tyrannical state. It's about having a society that's capable of holding its leaders accountable, that's willing to push back against abuses of power, and that's constantly working to maintain the balance between state and society.
So it's like having a strong immune system,
Right.
a society that's resilient enough to fight off infections of both tyranny and anarchy.
Exactly. And the book argues that building this kind of societal immune system requires several key ingredients: a vibrant civil society, a robust system of checks and balances, and a culture that values individual freedom and recognizes the importance of limiting state power.
But it's not just about domestic politics, right? The world is becoming increasingly interconnected. How does this narrow corridor framework account for the role of globalization and the growing influence of international institutions?
That's a great point. The book acknowledges that the narrow corridor isn't confined by national borders. Globalization has introduced a whole new level of complexity, blurring the lines between domestic and international politics.
Right, it's like we're all part of this globalized ecosystem now, and events on one side of the world can have ripple effects that are felt everywhere.
Exactly. And they argue that this new globalized landscape presents both challenges and opportunities for the narrow corridor. On the one hand, globalization has weakened the power of nation-states to some extent, making it more difficult for them to control their own economies and regulate global forces like multinational corporations.
So it's like globalization has unleashed these powerful forces that are difficult for any one government to control, which can lead to a sense of powerlessness among citizens and fuel those backlashes we see against globalization.
You've hit the nail on the head. And those backlashes, while understandable, can be dangerous. They can push societies away from the delicate balance of the narrow corridor, leading to a rise in nationalism, protectionism, and even authoritarianism. But it's not all doom and gloom.
Okay.
The book also points out that globalization has created opportunities for cooperation on a scale never seen before.
Right. So it's not just about competition. It's about finding ways to work together to address shared challenges like climate change, global pandemics, and economic inequality.
Exactly. And this is where the idea of the shackled Leviathan takes on a whole new dimension.
Okay.
It's not just about individual states finding the right balance within their own borders. It's about those states, those shackled Leviathans, cooperating with each other, finding ways to work together to address these global challenges, while still respecting national sovereignty and individual liberty.
So it's about building a more just and equitable world order, one that recognizes our interconnectedness and embraces cooperation, while still respecting the diversity of cultures and values that make up our world.
Exactly. It's a delicate balancing act, to be sure, but the book argues that it's the only way to ensure a future where both peace and prosperity are possible for all.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here,
Yeah.
from the importance of civil society to the challenges of globalization.
Right.
But let's bring it back to the present moment.
Right.
The book was published a few years ago before the COVID-19 pandemic, before the war in Ukraine, before the rise of inflation, and the threat of a global recession. How do you think this framework helps us understand these more recent events?
It's remarkable how relevant the book remains, even in the face of these unprecedented challenges. If we connect it to the bigger picture, these events, the pandemic, the war, the economic crisis, they're all stress tests for the narrow corridor. They expose the fault lines in our societies, and they reveal the choices that lie before us.
So it's like the book provides a lens through which we can make sense of these seemingly chaotic and unpredictable events to understand the underlying forces at play.
Precisely. And perhaps most importantly, it highlights the crucial role of leadership in these moments of crisis.
Right.
Leaders can either exploit these crises to consolidate their power and undermine freedom, or they can use them as opportunities to build trust, strengthen institutions, and reinforce the bonds between state and society.
So it's not just about weathering the storm, it's about choosing the right path forward, about making decisions that strengthen the narrow corridor, not erode it.
Exactly. And the book argues that this is where the concept of the shackled Leviathan is more relevant than ever. A shackled Leviathan isn't just a state that's limited by its own society. It's a state that's capable of responding effectively to crises, protecting its citizens, and maintaining order without resorting to authoritarianism.
So it's about finding that delicate balance between security and freedom, even in the most challenging of circumstances.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that we don't have to choose between the two, that we can have both, but only if we're vigilant and engaged.
Exactly. And that vigilance, that engagement, it's not just the responsibility of our leaders, it's the responsibility of every citizen. The narrow corridor isn't some preordained path. It's a choice, a commitment that we make every day to safeguard our freedoms, to hold our leaders accountable, and to build a more just and equitable society for all.
The book argues that modern democracies are facing some particularly intense pressure on that balance right now.
Yeah.
They highlight income inequality, globalization, and technology as three major forces pushing us closer to the edge of the corridor.
Oh,
Let's unpack those, starting with income inequality.
okay. The book argues that as the gap between the rich and the poor widens, it creates a dangerous feedback loop.
Right.
Those at the top gain more political clout, which they can then leverage to rig the system even further in their favor, leading to even greater inequality. It becomes a self-perpetuating cycle.
And this isn't just a moral issue, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about fairness. It has serious political consequences.
Exactly. It breeds resentment, erodes social trust, and creates fertile ground for division and instability.
We've seen that throughout history, haven't we?
Yes.
Extreme inequality, societies fracturing, and often it's those who promise simple solutions, those who exploit that anger and fear who end up taking power.
Precisely. The book warns that extreme inequality can be a death knell for democracy. It's not just a threat to our sense of fairness, it's a threat to the very fabric of our societies.
So how do we address this? It feels like such a massive systemic issue.
The book suggests that it requires a multi-pronged approach. Progressive taxation, robust social safety nets, and investments in education and opportunity for all. It's about creating a more level playing field, ensuring that everyone, regardless of their background, has a genuine shot at success.
It's about recognizing that a rising tide lifts all boats.
Yeah.
When everyone has a chance to succeed, we all benefit.
Precisely. And the book argues that this isn't just a moral imperative, it's economic common sense.
Right, because when a large segment of the population is struggling to make ends meet, it drags the entire economy down.
Yeah.
It's not sustainable in the long run.
Exactly. Now, shifting gears to globalization, which we touched on earlier,
Okay.
the book argues that while it has its benefits, it's also unleashed these powerful forces that can destabilize the narrow corridor.
Right. It's like we're all more interconnected than ever before,
Yeah.
but our institutions haven't quite caught up. We have global trade, global finance, global communication,
Right.
but our systems of governance are still largely national. It creates this tension, the sense that our governments are losing control.
Exactly. And that feeling of powerlessness, of being at the mercy of these global forces, it breeds resentment. It fuels those nationalist and protectionist impulses that we see bubbling up all over the world.
And as we discussed earlier, those impulses, while understandable, can be dangerous. They can push us towards the extremes, away from the delicate balance of the narrow corridor.
Precisely. So the question becomes, how do we address the legitimate concerns that people have about globalization?
Why?
Concerns about job losses, cultural homogenization, the loss of national sovereignty, without retreating into isolationism or protectionism.
It's about finding a way to manage these global forces, to harness their potential for good,
Right.
while mitigating their negative consequences.
Exactly. The book suggests that this will require a delicate balancing act, a rethinking of the role of the nation state in a globalized world. It's not about abandoning globalization altogether, but about finding ways to make it work for everyone, not just for a privileged few.
Okay. And what about technology? We live in a world of smartphones, social media, artificial intelligence.
Right.
It's evolving at a dizzying pace. How does this rapid technological change impact the narrow corridor?
That's another fascinating aspect of this book, how they weave in the role of technology. They argue that technology is essentially a tool, and like any tool, it can be used for good or for ill.
It's like fire, right?
Yeah.
It can warm our homes and cook our food, but it can also burn everything to the ground.
Exactly. And technology has this amazing capacity to both empower and oppress, often at the same time.
Right.
On the one hand, it can give citizens new tools to hold their leaders accountable, to organize and mobilize, to access information and connect with people all over the world.
We've seen that in recent years with the rise of social media and its role in various protests and movements around the world.
Exactly. But the book also cautions that these same technologies can be used by governments to monitor and control their citizens in unprecedented ways. We see this with the rise of mass surveillance, facial recognition technology, internet censorship.
Oh, yeah.
It's a growing concern.
It's like technology has given governments these incredibly powerful tools of control. And if those tools aren't balanced by equally powerful tools of accountability and transparency, the potential for abuse is enormous.
You've hit the nail on the head. And it's not just governments that we need to be wary of. The book also talks about the power of large tech companies with their vast troves of data and their ability to shape our thoughts and behaviors in subtle but profound ways.
Right? It's like we're all part of this vast digital experiment, and we're only just beginning to understand the long-term consequences.
Exactly. And the book doesn't offer any easy answers to these challenges, but it does urge us to be aware of them, to be vigilant about protecting our privacy and our freedoms in this digital age, and to demand that technology be used in a way that benefits all of humanity, not just a select few.
So we're talking about a world where technology is rapidly evolving. Globalization is blurring boundaries, and inequality is creating these massive power imbalances. It feels like the narrow corridor is getting squeezed from all sides. How do we even begin to navigate this complexity?
Yeah.
The book dives into some specific examples of societies entering the narrow corridor, and they've grouped them into three broad paths.
Right. They point to ancient Greece as an example of what they call the bottom-up route. Think of those fiercely independent Greek city-states constantly vying for power and influence. They were forced to cooperate to some extent because of the threat from the Persian Empire, a common enemy, if you will.
Right. It's like they had to band together to protect themselves, but they weren't about to give up their autonomy entirely.
Exactly. That tension, that balance between cooperation and competition was crucial.
Yeah.
They needed a united front against external threats, but they also jealously guarded their own internal affairs, their own systems of governance. And that dynamic, that constant push and pull between working together and maintaining their independence, is what ultimately led to some of the most innovative forms of government in history, including Athenian democracy.
So it wasn't a peaceful, harmonious process.
No.
It was messy. It was conflict-ridden. But that very tension, that struggle, is what drove them forward.
Precisely. And the book contrasts this with what they call the top-down route, where a strong, centralized state emerges first and then gradually creates the conditions for a more liberal society. England's a good example of this.
Okay.
You initially had a powerful monarchy that played a crucial role in unifying the country and establishing order, but over time you see Parliament gaining more power, asserting its authority, pushing back against the monarchy's attempts to overreach.
And that was a long, drawn-out
It's
process, right? Full of power struggles and even violence, if I remember my history correctly.
You're absolutely right. It wasn't a smooth or linear progression, but over centuries, this dynamic tension between the monarchy and parliament, this state-society bargaining, as the book calls it,
Right.
gradually shifted the balance of power, eventually leading to a more constitutional monarchy and a more liberal society.
Okay, so those are two paths to the narrow corridor,
Yeah.
bottom up and top down, each with its own challenges and opportunities.
Right.
What's the third path they mentioned?
The third path is what they call the slippery slope, and it's essentially the path to be avoided. It occurs when a powerful state emerges in a society without strong institutions or a deeply ingrained tradition of self-governance.
So it's like having all the ingredients for tyranny.
Right.
A power vacuum filled by a strong man, no real checks and balances, and a population that's either too scared or too fragmented to resist.
Unfortunately, that's the gist of it. They point to examples like Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, even more recent cases like North Korea or Venezuela societies where a powerful state emerged without those countervailing forces, those antibodies of a strong, engaged citizenry.
It's a sobering reminder that simply having a strong state isn't enough.
No.
It's the balance between state and society, that constant tension that keeps us honest, so to speak.
Exactly. And it's a balance that requires constant vigilance, a willingness to adapt, to reform, to stand up for what's right even when it's difficult.
That brings us to what might be the most important question of all. What can we as individuals do to strengthen the narrow corridor to make sure our societies don't veer off course?
The book emphasizes that the future of liberty isn't predetermined. It's not some inevitable outcome. It's contingent upon the choices that we make, the actions that we take every single day.
So it's not enough to just hope for the best, to assume that someone else will take care of it.
Right.
We all have a role to play.
Precisely. They highlight the importance of active citizenship, staying informed, engaging in thoughtful dialogue, holding our leaders accountable, and most importantly, being willing to stand up and speak out against injustice even when it's uncomfortable.
Because silence, they argue, is what allows those in power to chip away at our freedoms, often in the name of security or progress.
Exactly. The book reminds us that those who lived through the rise of totalitarian regimes often said they didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. They had accepted small compromises, looked the other way when their neighbors were targeted, convinced themselves that it couldn't happen here.
So it's about being vigilant, not just about our own freedoms, but about the freedoms of others, about the health of the system as a whole.
Precisely. And it's about recognizing that building and maintaining a shackled Leviathan,
Hmm.
a society where both state and society are strong, where individual liberty flourishes. It's not a spectator sport. It requires active participation, a willingness to engage in the messy, often frustrating work of democracy, and a commitment to those core principles of individual freedom, limited government, and the common good.
This has been an incredible deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground from ancient Athens to the digital age, from the importance of a free press to the dangers of income inequality. What's the one thing you hope our listener takes away from this conversation?
If there's one overarching message, it's that freedom is not a given. It's a constant negotiation, a balancing act that requires vigilance, engagement, and a willingness to defend the institutions and values that make it possible. We all have a part to play in shaping the future and ensuring that the narrow corridor remains open for ourselves and for generations to come.
It's a call to action for all of us. And on that note, we'll leave you with this final thought from the book. The fate of liberty rests not on some preordained historical trajectory, but on the choices that we make individually and collectively each and every day.
To a freer future.
Cheers to that. And to all of you listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the narrow corridor. We'll be back next time with another thought-provoking read, ready to unpack those big ideas that are shaping our world. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those minds open.